writing that somehow it's the religion that drives the insanity rather than other factors, and you're quite disparaging of those of us who argue that the religion is grafted on because you dismiss the imperialist argument and the hunt for oil and so forth. And yet, it seems to me that if you look at what has happened in this Arab world, particularly, but generally through the Muslim world, you take someone like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or bin Laden, the people who actually gave us 9/11. They didn't grow organically out of Afghanistan. They were brought there by the CIA. They didn't represent a major religious current anywhere. If you look at the Muslim Brotherhood coming out of Egypt, they were opposed to Nasser. You look at Hamas in the West Bank, they were opposed to the PLO, which was essentially a secular movement. And then the religious movements, as Chris has written, gain currency because they represent a fighting basis or an alternative when the secularists have failed. And for instance, you, in your writing, defended the invasion of Iraq, which was the invasion of a basically secular country.
Well, that's actually not true. I've never defended the invasion of Iraq.
Okay, well, then I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. But let me, what I thought you defended in your book, and I have the passages, and I don't want to put you on the spot or have you defend the position you don't take, but it seemed to me you had this very broad brush that somehow it is the religion that caused the problems. Whereas from my experience in traveling around this part of the world and covering events, the religion became a response to policies pursued by others. And that, I think, if you take Iraq, you have a very good example of that. Where for all the failings of Saddam Hussein, it was basically a secular society, and in which women were in a better position than they are now. And to take one example. And I think the point that Chris was making is that when you actually go out and see these societies, the mischief came not from a reading of the Quran. The mischief came from very enlightened, rational people, the best and the brightest, who were conducting the foreign policy of advanced nations.
Well, I'm certainly not going to deny that we have caused ourselves problems. And one of the reasons why we have been so inept in our foreign policy, I think, has a lot to do with our own faith-based thinking. The fact that we promote people to positions of power who, you know, in the president's case thinks God put him in the White House, and I've argued that that belief logically entails that God did not put him in the White House to make a catastrophic mistake. So I don't think we want someone making these decisions about when to go to war and when not to go to war who thinks that when he closes his eyes and just kind of tries to get a feeling for what to do, his intuitions just may be vetted by the creator of the universe. And I take these people at their word. I mean, people believe this stuff. So,
okay, but isn't it quite possible that this is just grafted on? You know, the Elmer Gantry phenomenon. I mean, that maybe Falwell and Pat Robertson don't really believe any of this stuff. That they use it to hype their own cause.
It is true that it's possible. Okay, first of all, I think there's a few variables we have to get on the table here. It is certainly possible, and I think this is true, that there is a distance between what people profess they believe and what they actually believe, and what they will say on a questionnaire, and then what is really operative at the level of their behavior. Now, what this distance is, that's something that's difficult to determine in any case. So when you have something like 38% of British Muslims now claim to believe that anyone who leaves the faith, anyone who commits the crime of apostasy, should be put to death. This is 38% of British Muslims. We're not talking about Pakistan or Afghanistan. That's quite an alarming finding. Now, what percentage of them would actually be willing to kill someone who leaves the faith? I don't know. I mean, there's a distance between what you think and what you're actually going to do. But the idea that somehow it is a tiny minority of people who profess these things, who actually believe them, there's no evidence for that. I mean, there is apparently an inexhaustible supply of suicide bombers. People like Chris seem to imagine that the cause of this is not their belief in martyrdom. It's not the idea that that you're going to get everything you want after you die, and there's nothing better than death in defense of Islam, which is what I argue. They seem to believe that it is poverty and economic desperation and lack of education. The reason why we know that can't be true is everything we find out about the kinds of people who hijack planes and fly them into buildings or blow themselves up on the tubes in the UK, they are disproportionately well off and they are disproportionately educated. This goes from the top, from people like Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who don't blow themselves up and maybe cynically manipulating people who really believe these things. But it goes all the way down through the 19 hijackers, all of whom were college educated. Many of them had PhDs. It goes to the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah, and it goes down to the foot soldiers who blow themselves up. Your likelihood of dying if you were affiliated with Hezbollah, dying through suicide bombing, goes up if you're better educated. I mean, and support for suicide bombing goes up in conjunction with literacy. This is not a movement of the poorest of the poor and the least educated. And the idea that it would be nice if it were. I mean, then the remedy is just spread the money around and teach people about all we've come to know in the last 2,000 years. But our situation is quite a bit more sinister than that. It is possible to be someone with the technical expertise, someone who can build a nuclear bomb, and to still think you're going to get 72 virgins in paradise. That's what we should be worried about, that these beliefs really are operative, and the idea that no one believes them while everyone professes them, I think is an act of faith none of us should be willing to adopt.
I'll let Chris respond, but for the people applauding, I just want you to consider one thing. No Muslim has ever used a nuclear weapon, and our own people did. Out of the most advanced, reasonable society, we dropped those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it really raises a very interesting question, but go ahead.
Well, Sam opens his book with this image of a suicide bomber, and then writes that everybody rejoices and the parents are proud, and it has this cut line at the bottom, the young parents learn his fate, and these are facts. I spent months and months in the Gaza Strip. I went to many of these funerals. In fact, the reality is, the first thing that happens is Hamas not only takes over the house of the bereaved before the body appears, but the entire street. They put plastic chairs out on the dirt street, they run white canopies over the top, and they trot the family out for the Western press. And if the family doesn't say the approved jargon and cant that Hamas wants them to, at the very least they're beaten up, if not worse. Hamas is a totalitarian organization. It shares many characteristics with the radical Christian right of this country, and to defy it is to court violence and death. And I think that this kind of assumption, first of all, that Palestinian mothers don't grieve for their children is really borders on racism. They grieve like any mother, and the notion that as you write that they somehow rejoice in the martyrdom of their children is just frankly not true. Having lived in Gaza and been in the houses, I've seen mothers who don't speak for days. The devastation that is visited on parents by the loss of a child is universal, first of all. Second of all, most of the suicide bombers in Gaza do not come from the middle class. They come from the refugee camps. The suicide bombers of 9/11, who I investigated for the New York Times, I covered al-Qaeda based in Paris, in Europe and North Africa after 9/11. They came from the middle class, but it's a very peculiar middle class because it is a class that is displaced from origin and dropped. You see it with French Muslims, the 5 million Muslims in France. And it is that horrible identity crisis that grips them. And in some ways, they don't belong to any culture. They don't belong in France or Germany, and they don't belong in Tunisia or Algeria or Saudi Arabia, where they come from. And it is that identity crisis that propels them into the arms of radical preachers who promote this utopian vision. It is that search for identity